Kenan Smith. I sit on the Appalachian State Foundation Board as well as an alumni. I also want to take the time to tell each one of you thank you for taking the time to come up, and really thank you for what you do in making a difference at your university, because you do make a difference, and I think at times we forget to stop and tell people thank you. And the slides yesterday regarding gratitude that I think are great. You know, we need to have a little bit more gratitude here in life. So I want to reach out to each of you and tell you thank you for what you do. Also, I want to, I've been notified of the universities and colleges from 8 different states that have talked to us and asked to be a part of this. So I want to reach across the state lines to all of you, tell you thank you for being a part of this too, and you are definitely welcome, because we all together can make a difference. I love hearing the comments over dinner about some of the connections that many of you have already made, that, hey, you've seen the emails for years from this person but have never met them, so you finally put faces to a name. It's another great thing about this summit is that we all are able to work together, make the new contacts. And there's a comment that I always love to hear, 1 + 1 sometimes does equal 3. And in this conference, I think that can definitely be the case. I've been asked to introduce our next 2 speakers. The first, I would definitely start off with the beauty part of the introduction. The beautiful and talented Mrs. Marty Pickett. Marty, isn't that the way that every introduction usually starts with you, the beautiful and talented?
Not exactly.
Not exactly. Well, I'm sorry. That should be the case. Marty is the Executive Director and General Counsel at the Trustee of the Rocky Mountain Institute, an entrepreneurial nonprofit think and do tank that drives the efficient use of resources. Again, there's a long bio. One thing I love about the bio, from Guilford College, so we have a North Carolina girl back home, is what we have from the Rocky Mountain. Marty, again, we've met 5 years ago when the original team came out. Just was a great host and hostess out at Rocky Mountain Institute. One thing that Marty, I would like to point out, also sits as the advisory board member for the Center for the Environment at Catawba College here in Salisbury, North Carolina. So thank you for coming back to your home state to help out. Now that I've done the introduction for the beauty, I have to introduce the beast to you. So Amory usually throws me under the bus, so I get to throw him under the bus every now and then too. So if you go onto RMI's website, there are 5 different bios for Amory. I mean, it is unbelievable, the different ones. So I've just taken a few bits and pieces, Amory, out of it, and all of them are straightforward. So I'm not going to really throw you under the bus anymore. Amory, of course, y'all got to hear last night, but is among the world's leading innovators in energy. Has been doing this with energies and industries for over 4 decades. So he started when he was 5. He told me that last night. Has worked with many, of course, with the U.S. Energy Departments of Energy and Defense, worked in over 50 different countries, has briefed over 23 heads of state. It goes on and on. Co-founded in 1982 the Rocky Mountain Institute, written more than 500 publications, 31 books, and of course, in 2009, was named Time named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. So without any further introductions, the beautiful and talented Ms. Marty Pickett, and the beast, Amory Lovins.
Thank you, Kenan. Good morning, everybody. It really is an honor and pleasure for Amory and me and for all of RMI. We also have another RMI, Mark Dyson. Would you raise your hand so people can see you? I'm getting messages that people can't hear me very well. How's that? So we really do appreciate the opportunity to be here. I have to say that when Kenan called me, actually, I remember where I was sitting because I heard this amazing North Carolina accent saying, could you help us do something in North Carolina? And I really got my attention. But Fred Standback had just given him a copy of Reinventing Fire. And Kenan and Hayes, who's in here somewhere, and Jed took that to heart and said, what can we do at Appalachian State University and the rest of the UNC system, and now many more universities. So it really is extraordinary since the first year Amory and I were here to what we heard yesterday about what is going on and what is going to happen over the next 3 days. It's really extraordinary. So thank you, Chancellor Everts, and for all of you involved for the amazing effort and opportunity for this week. So Amory, I've heard you talk a lot recently about the energy revolution, and we're talking this morning particularly about accelerating, or the accelerating clean energy revolution. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
Well, the energy revolution is
I know, you have to get really close. You have to,
is
hug it.
happening on both the supply and demand sides. On the demand side, like in this country, the consumption of electricity and gasoline has been falling since 2007, even as the economy grows. Same in much of Europe, same in Japan. Countries like Germany and Denmark are showing you can very systematically and consistently save energy faster than the economy grows. So you strengthen the economy further by cutting cost and reinvesting in the stuff you really want, and your total energy use shrinks. Give you a little idea of how this is scaling elsewhere. China, the world leader in efficiency gains and renewables, the only country that cut its energy intensity over 5% a year for 25 years running. China is planning to build 1 trillion watts of renewables, nearly a whole U.S. grid's worth, in the next 15 years, and then probably twice that much again by 2050. Germany helped kick that off, I think I mentioned last night, by getting the costs of solar power in particular down initially, so that China then took the manufacturing to scale. And still, Germany, I think I also said last night, installs solar power on rooftops for half our cost. The form that you fill out in Germany online to sign up for approval of your solar system and its connection to the grid is one short page. I think there's 24 different forms in parts of California, big stack. And yet in 20 of the United States, there are companies that will happily put solar on your roof, beat your utility bill, no down payment. Funny thing is, Deutsche Bank and some other major financial houses say that that'll be profitable worldwide in the next 20 years in at least 80% of the markets. And that, some of them say in the next 2 years, and I think that's perfectly plausible. There's a new study out in the last few days saying that utility scale solar is only half the cost of rooftop household solar, which is about right, except that they are both cost effective now in many places, including here, at their respective points of delivery. Because utility scale competes with the wholesale price, on your roof competes with your retail price, which is a lot bigger. That point is often missed. So, I'd like you to guess who just called central power plants dinosaurs. Too big, too inflexible, not even relevant for backup power in the long run. Who do you think said that? Greenpeace? Some radical environmental extremist? Actually, it was Union Bank of Switzerland. And most of the big financial houses concur with that.
So
That's a revolution.
So, Amory, you wrote Soft Energy Paths in 1976, and I agree with Kenan. I know you've been doing this much sooner, even than that. In fact, I have to tell you a funny story that's not on any of Amory's bios. He's never heard me say this, actually, but I remember talking to his father one time, no, it's very good, who told me about when Amory was just a little thing, like 5 or 6 years old, and he was standing at the bus stop with his lunchbox in one hand and the New York Times under the other. So I've just never forgotten that. And at our recent retreat, I had everybody raise their hands who had been born after 1976. How many people in here? Wow, lots. So in 1976, Amory published this incredible paper in the Foreign Affairs, and later became a book, which I read in college. So Amory, at that
You're not that old.
At that point, what were you thinking about the clean energy revolution that we're experiencing today? Would you have expected that sooner, now, or later?
Around now. This is a paper that came out at a time when everybody knew business as usual wasn't working, but nobody had articulated a coherent alternative way of thinking about it. What we were trying to do in national energy policy was too expensive, too slow, not logistically feasible, too dirty, too dangerous, not even economically self-consistent, because it would be so expensive that you'd have to raise the price of energy so high people wouldn't use that much. So it wasn't computing, although we didn't have computers in those days. But I reframed the problem to be not how do we get more energy, more of any kind from any source at any price, but what are we trying to do with the energy? What are the tasks we want it for, like hot showers and cold beer? And for each of those tasks or end uses, how much energy, of what quality, at what scale, from what source would do the job in the cheapest way? It may sound pretty logical, but nobody had asked that question before. And that gave better foresight into what would happen when, say, electricity had to compete not just with gas, but also with weather stripping. All the different ways of doing the job, like keeping you comfortable in the winter. So when that came out, it was at this magic moment. It was, when the coherent alternative was missing, and it was like dropping a seed crystal into a supersaturated solution. And suddenly there was this crackling sound, and it took on a whole new shape. It changed the energy conversation. Photocopiers had just become fairly widespread. And within a week or two, it was the most reprinted ever article in the history of the magazine. I think it still is. And then there was a firestorm. There were about 36 fatuous critiques to which I wrote tedious responses. That took about a year and a yay big congressional hearing record called the paperweight. And you would be amazed at what they were saying in those days about how if we didn't keep energy use in lockstep with GDP, we'd be back to caves and candles. Well, at the end of the year, the chief economist of Atlantic Richfield summed things up by saying, I, for one, don't care if Lovins is only half right. That would be better performance than I've seen from the rest of them. And within a year or two, and then accelerating, many of the firms that had led the blast of critiques started quietly hiring us to help them do it, because they did realize it made more sense and could make more money. And by 2000, the U.S. was exactly within a couple of percent either way. The Foreign Affairs graph of the soft energy path for saving energy. And today it remains basically on track. I'd suggested in that article that in '76 that the U.S. could cut its energy intensity, its energy use per dollar of GDP, by 67% over 50 years. 39 years in, we've saved 54%. At that rate, we'll hit 69% at 50 years. Anyway, we're about right. Now, there was another big transition in the same article, and that was to right-sized renewables, and that was delayed 3 decades because the article had explicitly assumed a fairly supportive, or at least friendly and neutral policy environment, and most of the time we got a hostile one. But over the past decade, renewables have gotten in gear. They are now on track. In fact, they are accelerating fast enough that they are now slightly ahead of the updated target that my colleagues and I set in 2011 in a book called Reinventing Fire. You all know about that book? Yeah. So that's going very encouragingly, even though we're still way behind China.
So fast forward to today, to the energy revolution, and particularly to the Energy Summit, and what do you have to recommend for this group to think about? What can higher education do to support and accelerate the current revolution?
Well, you can make smart and profitable investments in your own physical infrastructure, old and new, and it sounds like we're closing in on the first $500 million of the $2 billion prize, and that's going to keep expanding as we get smarter in technology and design and delivery improve. David Orr's wonderful work at Oberlin shows that such modernization can also be a great test bed for integrating with community deployment across all sectors. And on campus, of course, it manifests right pedagogy and integrative design. It engages students with their open and nimble beginner's minds in devising and then practicing innovation, then that really sticks. It can make your campus's electric meters run backwards, as my house does, and it will in our new innovation center this fall. Marty's been leading the project on a new office building and convening center we're doing in Basalt, Colorado, 10 minutes from the banana farm. It's got no heating or cooling systems. It'll be the most efficient thing ever built in cold climate zone for commercial building, but it has a sound business case. And of course, if you design and run things right, that frees up operating costs, but also can free up capital costs to support innovation and instruction, the core mission. By designing waste, it can make our buildings and operations delightful, healthful, productive, instructive, profitable. And the university can model and propagate the vision across boundaries, the broad and deep education, the skills of learning how to learn that are vital for building a society that's able to understand and avoid and solve its big problems. I gave a talk last year here on Imagine a University, reminding us that universities are where we play the long game, make the long bet, and that universities steward not just millennia of precious learning, but also civilizations painfully learn focus on excellence, on continuous improvement, on intelligent trial and error. And those are the tools we need if we're going to tenaciously transform ourselves over generations and respond flexibly to ever faster changing needs. Because we know from biology and from history that the most durable organisms, institutions, societies are not the strongest or the biggest or the smartest, but those that learn fastest and adapt most gracefully. And there is no better place than our campuses to sustain this long view and public purpose and rigorous insistence on quality. I also want to remind you another thing I said last year, that what we must do is not just about improving our physical plant, important though that is. We ought to be treating our physical plant not as an overhead to be minimized, but as a center of savings and learnings to be optimized. It's even more about exploring and expanding our mental capacities and our cultural competencies. As institutions of higher learning, we need to select, advance, reward, and reinforce administrators, faculty, staff, and above all, students who can take off their old departmental and disciplinary shackles, escape or span or demolish their comfortable silos, and reorganize their studies, their teachings, especially their learnings, around what our society needs to survive and thrive.
So I caught some eyes when Amory said, get rid of our shackles and silos. And I remember also last year Amory talked about, after all, it's called a university. So.
Well, I dropped out of 2 of them because they wanted me to specialize too much. And, you know, I've taught now at 10 universities. I've only taught subjects I've never studied so I can have beginner's mind. That's much more fun.
Which we're going to talk about in a minute, because I want Amory to share a little bit about how he approaches a problem. But first, let's think about a problem, an issue that we've had in the world for many years, and that's the oil story. So you talked a little bit last night about your recent talk to the world leaders in oil in Oslo. So maybe without repeating that, just a couple of highlights about why that was important and why you went and what you did there.
Well, I'd done a paper for Shell in November that they liked, have a 42-year relationship with them, and it was called Efficiency, the Rest of the Iceberg. And it was about how they can run their supply-side supertanker into the efficiency iceberg and sink and never even know what they hit because it wasn't on their chart because they weren't tracking it. So I laid out for the oil industry CEOs the full competitive landscape, including all the efficiency and some supply substitutions that are taking away their market, and concluded that they are more at risk from market competition than from even climate regulation. That is, they know a lot of their reserves can't be burned because of climate, but I pointed out even more of their reserves can't be sold because oil has become uncompetitive even at low prices before it becomes unavailable even at high prices. And stuff like Arctic oil has had an upside down revenue model for years. You can never charge enough to pay for it. It's more capital intensive than photovoltaics. So peak oil demand could come in this decade, not decades in the future as most suppose. As you can imagine, when I pointed out who their competitors are, it's not other oil companies. You know, it's all the innovators that are taking away their markets. Three of the biggest CEOs got up on stage and kind of did a dance that if they could spin around 3 times and tap their heels, they could weave this cloak of reassurance that none of this will happen quickly. And that's what I had to point out about how the pace of transformation is set by insurgents, not by incumbents, and even faster, it's set by the capital markets that will decapitalize you. Of course, the divest invest movement is an important part of that that's going on right now. So why did I do all this? Well, for the same reason I'm a member of the National Petroleum Council, although probably the only one driving an electric car with a license plate that says off oil. And it's to understand better whether there's a missing part in our work to get off oil, which we've been on for a long time. In electricity, we have 2 different practices. We work with incumbents and with insurgents because competition is good. And then we bring them all together in a safe place called ELAB, Electricity Innovation Lab, where they can talk and create mutual value rather than just lobbing grenades in public. That turns out to be a very constructive thing. And I've been wondering, should we be doing that also in hydrocarbons? Who will be the Eon of the hydrocarbon business? Can we accelerate that? And the business is now splitting down the middle. It's interesting to watch how fast. You may have noticed Chevron and ExxonMobil are publicly opposing, in rather strong language, a proposal by the big 6 European oil companies, including Shell, BP, Statoil, Total, to push for carbon pricing at the Paris conference. So this is not a monolithic industry, and within some of the smartest firms, some very interesting conversations are starting that we aim to be part of.
So how would you think the increasing disruptors in the oil industry might influence the goals of the group here this week?
Well, universities still buy lots of oil, mainly for mobility, but many are making impressive progress in getting off oil. And this is not just about super efficient and electrified vehicles. I noticed on Harvard's website, one of the places I dropped out of, and Harvard is probably a lot less agile than, say, a small campus like this one. 87% of their commuters are now on sustainable transport, which they subsidize because it's cheaper to do that than to pay the costs of what they were doing. And the menu of smart options is big and growing, way beyond smart, efficient electric vehicles and their fuller and timelier use. Smarter land use, truthful prices, IT integration for on-demand mobility and fuller use of idle assets. And fortunately, the generational change that our students represent is coming just at the right time to exploit the information revolution. You know, Gen X and Gen Y tend not to even want to own a car because it's cheaper and easier not to. How many of you here do not own a car? Well, that's going to grow. If I asked the same question, say, on a California campus, I'd get a lot bigger number. And you see, a young Londoner or Shanghainese or denizen of Palo Alto on an evening out can combine a lot of different modes, because we have these smartphone apps now that know where you are and can bridge those once awkward route gaps by summoning ubiquitous transport services on demand. I was reading a blog by a lady in San Francisco who says she's saving $11,000 a year by replacing her car with Uber, Lyft, public transit, walking, biking, and Getaround, which is a smartphone service that lets you briefly rent your neighbor's car when it's unneeded and parked, which our cars are about 95% of the time. So, you know, can young North Carolinians in an IT-savvy state like this be far behind? I don't think so. There's a lot to be done in the sharing economy that Tom Friedman writes about when he says the world's biggest media company, that's Facebook, owns no newspapers. The world's biggest hotelier, Airbnb, owns no beds. The world's biggest taxi service, Uber, owns no cars. They just figured out ways to let you use your neighbor's idle assets. And when your second biggest household asset is idle 95% of the time, that's a business opportunity. And in places as busy and diverse and sophisticated as, say, downtown Copenhagen or Helsinki can phase out cars, as they are doing to advantage over the next decade, why can't our campuses do the same thing?
So the rest of the story really is electricity. And Amory, I know in addition to talking to oil leaders, over the many years you've talked to electricity leaders in both traditional and innovative kinds of firms. So I'd love to hear what the shifts are that you're most hopeful about. And also, how do you think that influences the participants at this summit and universities in general?
Wow. Well, electricity is undergoing more and deeper disruptions than the oil industry or indeed any other sector I can think of. 21st meets 19th century head-on collision. And we don't want it to be a train wreck. The lights have to stay on. Of course, they're squeezed between falling demand and rising costs, but there's this more seismic set of shifts going on. The plates are shifting under their feet because we're shifting from hardware to software dominance, from molecules and atoms to bits and packets, hierarchies to network. The whole industry is morphing from centralized, supply-focused, fossil and uranium-fueled, brittle, essentially 19th century systems, to distributed, customer-focused, renewable, resilient 21st century systems. Huge change. In the middle, they're having to rebuild the whole system by 2050 anyway, because it's dirty and old and insecure and obsolescent, even though it's done a magnificent job. It's National Academy of Engineering rightly said it's the most complex machine on the planet and the biggest technological achievement. So there's 8 main forces converging. I sometimes draw these as Pac-Men surrounding and about to starting to munch away at utility revenues. There's end-use efficiency. There's integrative design that makes it a lot bigger and cheaper. And the more you save, the cheaper it gets. Flexible demand. Without inconvenience, you can shift your loads around. Distributed and especially renewable generation, which can be granular and really fast to deploy. Storage, especially distributed storage, and including smart electric vehicles. In fact, my electric vehicle is on a dumb grid. I'm in a rural co-op area, but every second my charger looks at the grid to see what the frequency is in a tiny band that tells whether the grid is short or long on electricity, and the charger in real time every second adjusts its charge rate between 0 and 7 kilowatts to help compensate that. So I'm dispatching a valuable service called fast regulation to the grid. And if they paid me what it's worth, I'd make a few bucks profit every night charging my car. And then there's shifting customer preferences and societal values, including a very strong movement away from monopoly and towards open markets and competition. There's new financial and business models, and there are regulatory shifts. We're deeply involved in the New York State effort to rewrite utility rules from scratch. So you get things like utilities and customers paying each other the fair value of the services they exchange. And unlike net metering, that can scale as far as you want without breaking. Important thing about those 8 converging disruptors is they don't add, they multiply, they exponentiate. Even 2 or 3 of them, let alone all 8, are so much more than the sum of the parts. It utterly shifts the competitive landscape. And there's a lot of different reasons that renewables are surging so fast, aside from that they can, and markets move into that white space. In Hawaii, folks do it for independence, not just to save money. In New Jersey, after Superstorm Sandy, they do it for resilience. In Japan, to save money and avoid nuclear restart, which they're rightly worried about. In India, to get reliable supply for the first time, and access for rural folks, and clean air. They have even dirtier air than China. In China, for clean air and climate and national security. Lots of different reasons. That's fine. They're all doing the same thing. And I think this is politically unstoppable now. You may have noticed in some states that had utilities trying to block or tax solar, make it discouraging and inconvenient, we've seen a fascinating thing emerge that's called the green tea movement, where leaders of the Tea Party, like Debbie Dooley, who's one of the founders of it, and now runs Conservatives for Energy Freedom, team up with environmentalists who also want green power. And the Tea Partiers join because they hate monopoly and they love competition, and it's a matter of individual freedom and choice. They're absolutely right about that. So even if they and the Greens may have different politics, they converge on the objective, and that has already flipped utility politics in Georgia, Arizona, Florida, places where the utilities thought they owned the whole system. You know, the regulators and the legislature were wholly owned subsidiaries of the power company. And I think in this state we are seeing shifts like that. It's very healthy. And from a political science point of view, it's really remarkable. So I think the main obstacles that are left are ideological, the coal and nuclear and big power lobbies, and also misconceptions about what I call the baseload fallacy, the notion that renewables really can't go anywhere without some unimaginable breakthrough in cheap storage. And I mentioned last night why that is not the case. But it's a fairly widespread myth. I was talking recently to the both the CEO and the VP strategy of a very large coal company. Hint, their stock prices just dropped 98%, and their bonds are trading at about 18%, indicating the market thinks they're about to default, which is probably true. And it turned out, even though electricity industry, the power plants, are 96% of their market, they hadn't the foggiest idea how the grid works. Myths can be dangerous.
So, Amory, we have a lot of students here. One of the things I'd love to hear you talk about is what advice might you give them to help accelerate the clean energy revolution, and maybe some business models that are happening to address some of the new changes in behavior taste? Because consumers, the way consumers respond is really important.
Yeah, well, let's see. Offer the services people want simply and directly, rather than intermediate means to those ends. You know, deliver hot showers and cold beer, not electricity. Where possible, rather than selling a device or commodity, lease the service So you and your customers both get rewarded for the same thing, like doing more and better with less for longer. So you keep shrinking the distance between value and customer. You completely align interests between provider and customer. Find waste, turn it into profit, especially focus on how smartphone apps and other information technology lets us turn idle assets into value. And I think it'd be interesting here for students to consider getting involved in a very interesting play. I don't know anything else like it in the country. There's a lot of exciting reforms bubbling up in small utilities. They're really agile. Austin Energy was just offered over 1 billion watts of solar power at under 4 cents a kilowatt hour. The Fort Collins Municipal Utility in Colorado that we work with is implementing a unanimous plan by City Council to cut that coal-dependent city's carbon emissions 80% while sustaining or improving affordability and reliability. And I said last year, so I'll bring this up again, if a small municipal utility can invent such a national and global model, why can't New River Light and Power, this unique little utility owned by the ASU Foundation, do something like that? Before its bulk power purchase contract expires, which I think is in another 7 years. Is it? 2021. How much electricity could it save or produce on site? And maybe that's an opportunity to do what the military and what Denmark are doing now, to re-architect the local grid into a network of resilient microgrids, so everything that needs to works even if the grid goes down, like in my house. I think that those opportunities for prosperity, stable prices, security, and clean power are today more urgent and valuable than ever right here. And I think that's something students could get pretty excited about. A lot of good business opportunities there.
So we heard from President Ross last night. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here, but I know from the beginning he has really emboldened Jed and the team to think big, think differently. So I know you have some advice for how to continue that spirit. What might that be?
Well, let's see. I had a wonderful mentor in my student days, the inventor Edwin Land, who said people who seem to have had a new idea have often just stopped having an old idea. Students are good at that. Not baked in yet. And then, of course, go to the root of the problem, cut to the chase. What are you really trying to do? And then forget about the way we do it now and just seek utter simplicity. Einstein said everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And then third, as General Eisenhower reputedly said, if a problem is too difficult to solve, enlarge it. We're used to chopping it into ever smaller bite-sized pieces. That actually makes it tougher, because we need to instead move the boundaries out until they encompass what the solution requires. And fourth, as Edwin Land also said, a failure is simply a circumstance not yet fully turned to your advantage. So don't give up. Figure out what that advantage is. Michael C. Muhammad allegedly said or wrote, everything's going to work out all right in the end. If it's not all right now, it's not the end yet. Just relax and keep on going.
So we've heard some great results already from the summit. We know we're on a great trajectory. Is it 2 billion, Jed, with a B? By 2025, we're hoping for savings, and already on that trajectory, but let's go better, right? So this is the great part, I think. This is what I've been encouraging Amory to do for many years, is really help us understand the way he thinks, the way he approaches a problem, and the way he helps rearrange, as he says, our mental furniture. So how might you give us some tools, some tips, some suggestions for this week?
Well, again, reaching back to what I learned from Edwin Land and from the conservationist David Brower and other wonderful mentors I've had over the years, Let me try to come up with a dozen or so ways of thinking. They're not habits of thought, which are typically bad habits, but try these. First of all, obviously, practice beginner's mind. No preconceptions. Open to everything. As if you'd never heard of this field before. Wait a minute, why are we doing it this way? And about a 4 or 5-year-old is usually really good at asking simple questions you didn't think of. Paul McCready taught us to avoid seeking the solution, because that implies there's just one, and it stops you from seeking even more elegantly frugal solutions. And anyway, the real challenge isn't finding the right answer, it's asking the right question. That's the hard part. Once you get the question right, the answer is self-evident, or, sorry, not the answer. Many answers are self-evident. The more the merrier. Start downstream. What I mean by that is, don't reason from, let's say, in the energy case, fuel through the power plant, through the grid, through the end-use device into the service you want. Start with the service you want. So if, for example, you're trying to deliver comfort in a hot, muggy place, you would start by asking, well, are we making the people comfortable or the building? I got that lesson once in Japan. I asked my hostess, why don't you heat your house? She said, why should I? Is the house cold? The house has no nervous system and no comfort sensation. So in our new building I mentioned, where there's no heating or cooling equipment, part of the reason for that is that we widened the comfort range from just a few degree band to something like 64 to 85 or 6 degrees or something like that by using a new thing called the Hyper Chair out of Berkeley. It's an ordinary looking office chair, but built into the back and seat is a pair of 7-watt electric seat heaters from a car and 3 little computer fans to keep you respectively hot or cool. And they're controlled by a little touch screen run by a laptop lithium battery pack underneath with a little pull-out cord, so if you use it, you can recharge it quickly. But you probably won't use it except in extreme conditions, and then everybody can have exactly the comfort conditions they want. Well, it's a whole lot easier and cheaper to give everybody the comfort they want in their own skin than to heat all this empty space. Interesting approach. And then, of course, you can expand the range of conditions in which people feel comfortable. You can buy about 9 Fahrenheit degrees of comfort with a good ceiling fan. You can actually feel cooler by looking at a picture of an icy blue waterfall up on the wall, even though that's not part of comfort theory. You can avoid putting heat in the building from inside or outside. You can cool the building passively. You can cool the building actively but without refrigeration. Turns out that list is enough to do the job anywhere in the world before you get to super efficient refrigerative cooling, before you get to better controls and storage and stuff. So doing the right steps in the right order, but then let's go upstream from there. Suppose you're no longer delivering a whole lot of air for cooling, you're just delivering air for ventilation. That's easy to do passively. And by the way, you don't need those huge ducts. It saves a whole lot of cost and space and complexity. Perhaps you're not delivering much chilled water anymore, or any. Well, let's see, if you have less flow, or if you have less friction because you use fat, short, straight pipes instead of skinny, long, crooked pipes, then you need a smaller pump and a smaller motor and smaller electrical systems to supply it, and less power from the power plant and less fuel going into the power plant. But as you go back upstream, the compounding losses turn into compounding savings with a tenfold leverage to climate benefits and pollution savings back at the plant. just from the reduced flow. So start downstream, work upstream. Another thing I learned from physics, my original disciplines, is the opposite of every great truth is also a great truth. So always look at the opposite of what you think is true. And we also learned from physics, if it's not beautiful, it's probably not true either. Integrate. Get many benefits from each expenditure. My record so far is the arch in the middle of my house has 12 functions at one cost. But I see quite a few designers now getting up in the kind of 7, 8, 10 range. That's good. Nature never does just one thing. If we design the way nature does, harnessing that billions of years of experience in which all the 99% of designs that didn't work got recalled by the manufacturer. Just look at the designs that work. They have a whole lot to teach us about design. One of the things we learn is they do many, many things at once. There are no specialists. There are no narrow categories. And that means thinking in whole systems, where you solve for pattern, you do vision across boundaries. I like odd combinations of ideas. It's like the notion in agronomy or genetics that white crosses are good. The more you learn about many diverse things, the more you can cross-pollinate disciplines that normally wouldn't meet in one major, but they're really fruitful. I used to work on, for example, tertiary structure of proteins based on knot theory, which I got from mountaineering, but it's actually a branch of mathematics. But I was doing rope work and got to thinking about knots. Anyway, long story. Always ask what's the right size for the job. Scale is largely ignored, but very, very fruitful. In an economist book of the year called Smallest Profitable, I started looking for diseconomies of scale in electric power systems and found over 200 of them. 2/3 of which also apply to, say, water and wastewater systems. And just about everything you look at, there's an important question about what's the right size, and it's probably not the scale we're using. No muda. Muda is a wonderful Japanese word that means waste, purposelessness, and futility. Literally, it's no purpose. It's using a resource in a way that produces no customer value. And there's a dozen odd kinds of muda, like making bad quality, making something nobody's asked for, having stuff sit around, having unnecessary process steps, motion without purpose, and so on. Well, if you develop special muda spectacles, you can see waste just about everywhere. There's a little summary of this in, I think, chapter 7 of Natural Capitalism, thereabouts, that's a boil down of a great book by Womack and Jones called Lean Thinking. They actually like it better than their book because it's even leaner. But notice I said no muda. The right number is 0. Don't just try to have only the amount of muda your competitor has or the other campus has. Right number is 0. Steer by a tall star. Get rid of the muda. And if you set that goal, you're much more likely to get real close to it. And then a few learnings finally on implementation. If you want to understand people's motives, start by following the money. Figure out what the economic interests of the parties really are, or what they think they are, which may be different, and you'll much better understand what's going on. Look for trim tabs. If you understand which stakeholders have which interests, you can often find little tweaks you can do that will have outsized effects on their behavior. Then you can understand what barriers are there that need to be busted. That's even more important than getting prices right. They're both important, but ability to respond to price is even more important than the price itself. But one of the things I've learned over the last few decades is that even though economics suffers from a serious map territory confusion and is a very incomplete view and is meant to be greedy, not sufficient, and efficient, not fair, economics still teaches us that best buys eventually win, and that's right. And that's what we're seeing happen right now that's transforming energy. But you also have to let the right things compete. We cooked up in the 80s about 20 ways to make markets in saved resources, like negawatt markets. And it's really interesting now in about 3/5 of the states where efficiency and demand response can bid directly against electric supply. Guess who wins? Efficiency tends to win, sometimes 90-odd% of the time, because it's cheaper. Look for ways to add feedback. You will often find as you dig into what's happening in a complex system that there's no feedback, and systems without feedback are stupid by definition. So you will often find that adding it is really powerful. The late Dana Meadows had a wonderful list of, I believe it's 12 ways to intervene in a complex system. We have all our incoming folks at RMI study that. It's just one page. Tweaking little things like, coefficients like interest rates or discount rates or whatever turns out to be the least important way to intervene. The most powerful way to intervene is to change the mindset of the people who make the rules. So try to figure out who makes the rules. Where do they get the stuff that's in their head? What's their epistemology? And if you can start rooting around in there, you'll find some really fruitful things to do. Like there is something called the Financial Accounting Standards Board. I ran into Pete Carell when he was running Georgia Pacific, and he said, I could make 3 times more money from our forests for my shareholders if they would change this funny accounting rule that makes me account for forests on my balance sheet as a business in liquidation. I can only count the market value of board feet of lumber. I'm not allowed to count watershed management, recreational wildlife value, carbon sequestration, and all the other myriad values my forest provides. But if I could value those, I could manage to them. Well, isn't that an interesting idea? What would it take to change that accounting standard? That would have huge implications, among other things, for climate. Aikido politics. How many of you know about Aikido? Okay, which is a vigorous but essentially nonviolent martial art. You're not trying to hurt somebody. And it's a blending of energies. If you were to come rushing at me to attack me, I could stay rigidly fixed in position and hope you'll bounce off, or I could kind of welcome you and turn around the way you're going and help you harmlessly pass. And you might fall down, but it wouldn't really come to harm. Well, you can do the same thing in managing conflict. Our friend Tom Crum at AIKI Works in Aspen has a wonderful book and video on the magic of conflict. And we have a lot of wonderful experience in how to embrace conflict and turn it into a resolution that's good for everybody by not being oppositional and honoring others' beliefs as you would your own, even if you disagree with them. If you do this in utter sincerity, it really works. I would urge you to practice applied hope, not mere glandular optimism. I gave a talk on this here before, I believe. Yes, yeah, that's what I said. If you go on rmi.org and search in the search window on Berkeley, you'll find a text about that. applied hope. And indeed, the reason we're all here is applied love. Thank you.
Have you ever noticed how every time Amory speaks in this building, it thunders? Thank you.